The room smelled like wood polish and stale cigarette smoke. 100 folding chairs pressed close together, most of them filled. The stage was bare except for 2 microphones on stands, a glass of water beside each one, and a pair of acoustic guitars resting against wooden stools. The lights were dim except for the stage itself, which glowed under 2 spotlights that made the air look thick and golden. Outside, the streets of Los Angeles hummed with traffic, but inside the venue, the only sound was breathing. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A woman near the front clutched a notebook in her lap like it might fly away. This was not a concert. This was something else, something heavier. It was late spring in 1974, and the folk music world had been splitting quietly down the middle for months. Not over politics, not over record deals, over something harder to name. 2 men, both in their 20s, both gentle-voiced and soft-spoken, had become symbols of something larger than themselves. James Taylor, with his long frame and sad eyes, had already tasted fame that felt like drowning. Jackson Browne, younger by a few years, had just begun to climb. Both wrote songs that made people cry in their cars. Both had voices that sounded like confessions. But their songs came from different places. Taylor's were inward, private, full of quiet pain and survival. Browne's were outward, searching, full of longing and unanswered questions. And somehow, without either of them asking for it, the folk scene had turned them into rivals. The idea for the event had started as a joke. A music journalist, drunk at a party in Laurel Canyon, had said it would be fun to see them go head-to-head. Someone else said it would never happen. Taylor was too private. Browne was too serious. But the idea stuck. It spread through the clubs and coffee houses like a rumor. People started talking about it like it was already real. Radio DJs mentioned it on air. Managers started getting calls. And then, quietly, someone made it official. A benefit show. 2 sets, 1 stage. Taylor and Browne, back to back, each performing their own material, no judges, no winner. Just 2 men and their songs. But everyone knew what it really was. A test. A measuring. A way to settle something that had no clear question. James Taylor had arrived early. He always did. He sat backstage in a folding chair with his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands resting on his knees. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hair fell over his eyes. He did not look nervous, but he did not look relaxed either. He looked like someone waiting for something he could not control. His manager stood near the door, speaking quietly with someone from the venue. Taylor did not listen. He stared at the floor. His mind was somewhere else. He had been clean for a year. 1 full year without the pills, without the fog, without the thing that had almost killed him. He had written songs about it. He had sung about it in front of thousands of people. But he still woke up some mornings unsure if he believed in himself. Tonight felt like a test he had not studied for. Jackson Browne arrived 15 minutes later. He came through the back entrance with his guitar case slung over his shoulder and a canvas bag full of notebooks. He was younger than Taylor by 3 years, but he carried himself like someone who had already lived a long life. His face was serious, his eyes dark and thoughtful. He shook hands with the sound engineer and asked about the microphones. He wanted to know if they would pick up the softer notes. He wanted to know if the room had good acoustics. He was careful. Precise, he believed that songs were fragile things, and that performing them badly was a kind of betrayal. He had heard the rumors. He knew people were comparing him to Taylor. He knew some people thought he was trying to replace him. It was not true, but it did not matter. Perception had weight, and tonight that weight felt heavy. The 2 men did not speak before the show. They were in separate rooms, separated by a hallway and a locked door. There was no hostility. There was no drama. But there was distance. It had been there for a while. They had met once before, at a party in Malibu, and the conversation had been polite but stiff. Taylor had complimented Browne's songwriting. Browne had thanked him and said nothing else. It was not coldness, it was caution. They both knew they were being watched. They both knew that every word they said would be repeated, analyzed, turned into evidence of something. So they said less. They stayed apart, and the distance became its own kind of story. The audience did not know any of this. They only knew what they had read, what they had heard, what they had decided to believe. Some of them were Taylor people. They loved his voice, the way it sounded like it might break at any moment, but never did. They loved the sadness in his songs, the honesty, the feeling that he was singing directly to them. Others were Browne people. They loved his lyrics, the way he asked questions that had no easy answers. They loved the hope buried inside his melancholy, the belief that understanding was possible, even when it hurt. And then there were the people who loved both, who did not understand why anyone had to choose, who had come tonight, hoping the whole thing would dissolve into mutual respect and shared beauty. But even they felt the tension. It was in the air. It was in the silence. The lights went down. A man walked on stage and spoke into the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming. He mentioned the charity the event was supporting. He did not say much else. He did not need to. Everyone knew why they were here. He introduced James Taylor, and the applause was immediate and loud. Taylor walked out slowly, his guitar in one hand, his shoulders slightly hunched. He did not smile. He did not wave. He sat down on the stool, adjusted the microphone, and began to tune his guitar. The audience waited. He took his time. When he finally looked up, his eyes scanned the room without settling on anyone in particular. He cleared his throat. He said nothing. He just started playing. The first song was quiet, so quiet that people in the back rows leaned forward to hear. It was one of his older songs, one about being far from home and not knowing how to get back. His voice was soft, almost fragile, but it filled the room. Every word landed with weight. Every pause felt intentional. He did not perform the song, he lived inside it. And the audience went still. They did not clap between verses. They did not move, they just listened. By the time he finished, the silence was so thick it felt like a presence. Then the applause came, long and steady, and Taylor nodded once and moved into the next song. He played 5 songs total. None of them were loud. None of them were triumphant. They were all about struggle and survival, about waking up and deciding to keep going even when you did not know why. They were about loneliness and recovery and the strange relief of admitting you were broken. The audience loved them. They applauded after each one, but there was something underneath the applause, something heavier than admiration. It was recognition. They saw themselves in him. They saw their own fears, their own pain, and it made them feel less alone. When Taylor finished his set, he stood, said a quiet thank you, and walked off stage. He did not linger. He did not soak in the applause. He just left. Backstage, he sat down in the same folding chair and stared at his hands. His manager came over and told him it went well. Taylor nodded but did not respond. He could still hear the applause, faint now, muffled by the walls. He did not feel relieved. He felt empty. Performing always did that to him. It took something out of him that did not come back right away. He closed his eyes and waited for the next part. Jackson Browne walked on stage 10 minutes later. The applause was just as loud, but it had a different quality. It was expectant, curious. People wanted to see what he would do. He sat down, adjusted his microphone, and looked out at the audience. He did not smile either, but his face was open. He looked like someone about to tell you something important. He strummed his guitar once, then stopped. He leaned into the microphone and spoke for the first time that night. His voice was calm, clear, steady. He said he was honored to be here. He said he admired James Taylor. He said he hoped tonight would remind people that music was not a competition. It was a conversation. Then he started playing. His first song was different from Taylor's. It was not quieter or louder. It was not better or worse. It was just different. Where Taylor's songs turned inward, Browne's reached outward. Where Taylor sang about survival, Browne sang about searching. His lyrics were full of images, highways, sunsets, strangers passing in the night. He sang about wanting to understand the world and being afraid you never would. He sang about love as a question, not an answer, and the audience listened just as carefully as they had for Taylor. They leaned in, they held their breath, they felt the weight of his words, but something else was happening too. As Browne played, a tension began to build in the room. It was subtle at first, a few people shifting in their seats, a few whispers. Someone near the back stood up and left, and the door closing behind them sounded louder than it should have. Browne did not seem to notice. He kept playing, but the audience was dividing. Some people were leaning forward, fully absorbed. Others were leaning back, arms crossed, faces unreadable. The Taylor people were measuring Browne against something they had already decided. The Browne people were doing the same in reverse. And the people who had come hoping for unity were starting to realize it was not going to happen. Browne played 5 songs just like Taylor. His last song was the longest. It was about a man driving alone at night, thinking about everyone he had ever loved and wondering if any of them remembered him. The melody was beautiful and sad, and his voice cracked slightly on the final line. When he finished, the applause was strong, but it was not unanimous. Some people clapped hard, standing, shouting. Others clapped politely, briefly, then stopped. Browne stood, nodded, said thank you, and walked off stage. He did not look disappointed. He did not look triumphant. He just looked tired. Backstage, the 2 men were in separate rooms again. Neither of them had heard the other's full set. The walls were thick. They had heard only pieces, muffled melodies. The rise and fall of applause. Taylor sat with his head in his hands. Browne sat with his guitar across his lap, staring at the strings. The managers were talking in the hallway, voices low and serious. The audience was filing out, some of them arguing, some of them silent. The night was over, but nothing had been settled. 2 weeks later, a review appeared in a Los Angeles music magazine. It was long and detailed and tried very hard to be fair. It praised both men. It called Taylor a master of emotional restraint and Browne a poet of the open road, but it also declared a winner. Not in those words exactly, but the implication was clear. The writer believed Browne had the future, Taylor had the past. The review was read by thousands of people. It was quoted on the radio. It became part of the story. And the split in the folk scene deepened. James Taylor read the review alone in his kitchen. He read it twice, then folded the magazine and set it on the counter. He did not call anyone. He did not write a response. He just stood there for a long time, looking out the window at the trees in his backyard. He thought about the night of the show. He thought about the silence in the room when he played. He thought about how much it had taken out of him and whether it had been worth it. He did not have an answer. He made a pot of coffee and sat at the table and stared at nothing. Jackson Browne read the same review in a hotel room in San Francisco. He was on tour, 3 weeks into a long string of dates that would take him across the country. He read it once, quickly, then set it aside. He did not feel happy. He did not feel vindicated. He felt strange, uncomfortable, like he had won something he had not asked to compete for. He thought about Taylor sitting on that stage, alone under the lights, pouring himself out in front of strangers. He thought about how hard that must have been. He thought about how much courage it took, and he felt a sadness he could not name. The 2 men did not speak for a long time after that, not because they were angry, not because they had fought, but because the distance had grown too wide, and neither of them knew how to cross it. They played in the same city sometimes, on different nights, in different venues. They heard about each other through friends, they read about each other in magazines, but they did not meet. The folk scene moved on. New artists emerged. Trends shifted. The rivalry faded into memory, replaced by newer dramas and newer divisions. But for the people who had been there that night, the memory stayed sharp. They remembered the silence. They remembered the tension. They remembered the feeling that something important had happened, even if they could not say exactly what. Years passed. Taylor kept making music, slower now, more careful. He learned to protect himself, to say no, to walk away from things that hurt. He learned that survival was not a one-time event. It was a practice. Browne kept making music too, and his songs grew more political, more urgent. He sang about injustice and hope and the belief that people could change if they tried hard enough. Both men aged. Both men softened. The sharpness of their youth gave way to something quieter, something wiser. It was not until the late 1980s that they saw each other again. It was at a tribute concert for a mutual friend, a songwriter who had died too young. The event was small, private, just a handful of musicians and close friends. Taylor arrived first. He stood near the back of the room, hands in his pockets, watching the stage. Browne arrived a few minutes later. He saw Taylor across the room and hesitated. Then he walked over. They stood facing each other for a moment without speaking. Then Browne extended his hand. Taylor took it. They shook hands, slow and deliberate, and neither of them let go right away. Browne said it was good to see him. Taylor said the same. They talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, about the friend they had lost, about how strange it was to get older, about how much music had changed. They did not mention the night in 1974. They did not mention the review or the rivalry or the way the folk scene had split. It was not necessary. They both knew, and they both knew it had not mattered the way people thought it did. At the end of the night, after everyone had played and the room had emptied, the two men stood outside on the sidewalk. The air was cool, the street was quiet. Browne said he was sorry if things had ever felt strange between them. Taylor said he was sorry too. They were not sure what they were apologizing for exactly, but it felt right to say it. They talked for a while longer, about songs they were working on, about places they wanted to visit, about the strange weight of being known by strangers. Then they said goodbye. They did not promise to stay in touch. They did not make plans. They just shook hands again and walked in opposite directions. The rivalry had never really been between them. It had been between the people watching. It had been between the versions of them that existed in other people's minds. The real James Taylor and the real Jackson Browne had only ever been two men trying to write honest songs and survive the weight of being seen. They had never wanted to compete. They had only wanted to be understood. In the years that followed, both men continued to play. Their audiences overlapped now. People who loved one often loved the other. The lines that had once seemed so clear blurred and disappeared. And when people talked about that night in 1974, they talked about it differently. Not as a battle, not as a contest, but as a moment when two people stood on a stage and gave everything they had, and the world demanded they be enemies when all they ever were was human. There is no lesson at the end of this story, no moral to underlie, just two men, two voices, two sets of songs, and the quiet understanding earned slowly over decades that there was never anything to win, only something to give, only something to share, only the hope that someone somewhere would listen and feel a little less alone.